The 1960s were a time of change, civil rights struggles, and economic growth. This decade brought the world a cultural revolution, space exploration, and rapid technological advancements. But behind America's shining storefronts, another reality existed. Thousands of people were living on the streets, in slums, and in shelters. Homelessness is not just the absence of a roof over one's head. It is a complex social phenomenon caused by economic, political, and personal factors. In the 1960s, the homeless population in the U.S. consisted of a diverse group of people with different backgrounds. They were divided into several categories: hobos, migrant workers traveling the country in search of temporary jobs, often seen on railroads and freight trains, or in camps for seasonal workers; bums, people who lived on handouts, avoided work, and often suffered from alcohol or drug addiction; Skid Row inhabitants, the residents of the poorest areas of major cities, living in cheap hotels, shelters, or abandoned buildings. Another major group consisted of the mentally ill and war veterans. Many psychiatric hospitals were shut down, and Korean War veterans often did not receive the support or treatment they needed. Refugees and immigrants, many of those who came to the U.S. seeking a better life, ended up homeless due to unemployment and discrimination. Homeless people in the 1960s often formed temporary settlements in parks, under bridges, and in industrial areas. Many of them were constantly on the move, trying to find work or simply survive in harsh conditions. But homelessness was not just an American problem. In the UK during the 1960s, homelessness was also a crisis due to housing shortages and high unemployment. Many sought refuge in shelters and hostels, but housing reforms were slow to address the issue. In France, major cities like Paris had entire districts inhabited by homeless people, particularly among immigrants from former colonies. In the USSR, homelessness was officially denied, but in reality, it existed. People without registration or jobs could be detained and sent to forced labor camps. Thus, homelessness in the 1960s was a global issue, taking different forms depending on a country's social and economic structure. Why were thousands of people left without a home in the 1960s? The rise of technology and automation led to job losses, especially for unskilled workers who could not find alternative employment. Psychiatric reforms of the 1950s and 1960s resulted in the closure of state mental hospitals, leaving many patients on the streets without support. Alcoholism and drug addiction worsened the crisis, as the availability of cheap alcohol and the rise of new drugs such as amphetamines and heroin contributed to social decline. The housing crisis and gentrification in major cities pushed the poor out onto the streets, as affordable housing became out of reach for many. The lack of social support made things worse, as government welfare programs were still in their infancy, and charities could not help everyone in need. Migration from rural areas to cities increased the number of people without financial resources, struggling with high job competition and expensive housing. Korean War veterans suffering from PTSD, disabilities, and lack of medical care also ended up homeless, unable to reintegrate into civilian life. An important factor was also the cost of food. In the 1960s, budget-friendly meals could be found in diners and automatic restaurants. Automats, where a cup of coffee cost 10 cents, a sandwich 25-30 cents, and a full meal at a cheap cafe was around $1. For those living on the streets, food often came from charity soup kitchens, where simple meals like soup, bread, and tea were handed out for free. Many homeless people scavenged for food in restaurant dumpsters or spent their small earnings on cheap alcohol and cigarettes, often prioritizing these over proper nutrition. The homeless population in the 1960s was diverse in age and background. The majority were middle-aged men, often between 40 and 60 years old, many of whom had lost jobs due to industrial decline or suffered from mental health issues. However, there were also younger individuals in their 20s who had run away from home or struggled with addiction, as well as elderly people who had no family to support them. Women were a smaller percentage of the homeless population, but many of them lived in shelters with children or worked as domestic help in exchange for food and lodging. Unlike today's homeless populations who often live in tents in the 1960s, people were more likely to stay in shelters or slum districts. One of the most infamous areas was Skid Row in Los Angeles, which became a true refuge for the homeless. Here, one could find cheap hotels for a couple of dollars a night, charity soup kitchens, and even short-term daily work. However, life in these places was far from easy. Poor sanitation, high crime rates, and constant violence made survival extremely difficult. Many sought shelter in abandoned buildings, under bridges, or on vacant lots, while some preferred sleeping in city parks despite the risk of being arrested by the police. Certain states were considered easier for homeless people to survive due to milder climates and access to social services. California, particularly Los Angeles and San Francisco, became hotspots due to the warmer weather and the presence of Skid Row areas with shelters and free meals. New York City had a large homeless population as it offered numerous missions and charities, though winters were harsh. Florida was another state where many homeless individuals migrated, as the year-round warm climate reduced the need for winter shelter. However, in states with extreme cold, such as Minnesota or Illinois, survival was far more challenging without adequate shelter. Various charity organizations and religious missions tried to provide shelter and food for those in need, but the scale of the problem far exceeded the available help. The homelessness crisis of the 1960s laid the foundation for future government policies. By the 1970s and 1980s, cities began implementing more structured welfare programs. But the problem never truly disappeared. Many of the issues, lack of affordable housing, mental health struggles, and addiction, remain relevant today. Studying this era helps us understand the long-term effects of economic and social policies on vulnerable populations. Will we ever find a permanent solution to homelessness, or is it an inevitable part of modern society? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.